Hello, Alamal. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Mona Cottage Books. I'm Selby, and today I'm going to talk about what I read in March and April. So I didn't read as much in March and April as I normally would. I was moving and I've been very busy, but I have read a few very interesting books and I'd like to share them with you. I have my notebook. This is my book notebook where I keep track of everything that I've read this year. And the first one I'm going to talk about is The Hatmakers. So The Hatmakers is it's centered around Cordelia. She's a young girl. I think she's like about 10. And this takes place in what I assume to be something like late 1800s, early 1900s London. Because it's a magical book, it's not actually historical fiction, but it is very influenced by history. And if I knew more about British history and the king that they reference, I might know exactly when this happens, but I don't. Anyway, in this world, there are magical hat makers, and there's magical clothing makers, and magical boot makers, and a variety of other magical watchmakers too. I think something like that. And all these magical families don't like each other. It talks about it in the book. I won't go into everything, but this is a middle grade. If I didn't already say that, it's a middle grade. And Cordelia, her father also at the beginning of the book has been lost at sea. And then there's like an impending war with France, and it's a little complex, a lot going on. But if you or your young reader enjoys magic, and wants kind of, this is a little bit interesting, like a little bit different take, because sometimes they talk about, magical objects, but they don't ever talk about who makes the magical objects. Well, the hat makers make the magical objects, and sometimes it doesn't go as well as planned. So that's kind of funny. I gave this book 4 stars, and I think that I gave it 4 stars because there's some things missing. I feel like some plot points started and didn't get finished. They may get finished in the next one, which is The Mat Makers. So maybe you'll read that one and I'll have a different feeling about the first one. But it was well written and it was interesting. And I think that a lot of kids ages 7 to like 12 would really enjoy it. It's magic oriented and adventure, and there's some good little twists in there too, as it's kind of a little bit mysterious. So I recommend The Hatmakers by Tamsin Merchant. Next up is Tulipomania, the story of the world's most coveted flower and the extraordinary passions it aroused. So this is a adult nonfiction, and it's all about the tulip mania. So if you don't know, in the 1630s in the Netherlands, people went crazy for tulips. The prices went through the roof, and it was kind of like the first economic bubble. And I actually did a whole video on this because I really like this book. And I live in the Netherlands, and some of the places that the author, Mike Dash, references in this book are actually here in Haarlem. And I went to some of them. So this video will show you some of the places in Haarlem that were there during the 1630s, or what they would have looked like, so you can get a little bit more information about Tulipomania if you are interested in something like that. Because it was a great historical read. I gave it 4 stars. A little slow, lots of information, but overall quite interesting. Next up, we have The Tale of Truthwater Lake by Emma Carroll. And one of the reasons that I bought this book is because it said that Emma Carroll was the master of his middle grade historical fiction. And I was thinking back and I was like, well, I don't think I've read a lot of historical fiction, like for middle grade. I've read it for adults, but so I was curious. And I would say that it's half historical fiction and half future. It's not sci-fi, but so half of it is about this girl. I think she's in the 1950s in England. I don't remember exactly where, near the coast. So she is training to swim the English Channel. So she's got a lot going on in her life. And then it also connects with this girl in the 2030s, so in the future, and explores climate change and how things are different then. but their stories kind of combined. So that was actually really interesting, and I really enjoyed it. So it was like realistic fiction, but it also had some like magic realism elements. So yeah, I think that's a good read, especially for kids, maybe 8 to 12 would really enjoy The Tale of Truthwater Lake. Up next, we have Remarkably Bright Creatures. Now, I have to say that I gave this book a 3 out of 5 stars, and but that doesn't mean that it wasn't a good book. It just means that it was a bit of a downer. So Remarkably Bright Creatures centers around Tova, which is this lady in her 70s, and her son died when he was 18, or he went missing. And her husband recently died, and so she's, she works, she doesn't have to work, but she works cleaning the aquarium at night. And so it's kind of, yeah, I mean, it's a downer. She's had a lot of loss, and she's going through some difficult times. The flip side to that is this interesting character where they get the title Remarkably Bright Creatures is there's a giant Pacific octopus that lives in the aquarium, and he kind of helps her out. And we do get chapters that are voiced by Marcellus, who is this octopus, and he is an interesting character. And so he kind of saved the book for me, that he was the most interesting part, and I would have really liked to have more about Marcellus. But in the end, it was about Tova and also Cameron, and then the other people that live in the town, and dealing with grief and moving on and that kind of stuff. So, but it was a good book for a book club. So if you get to talk to other people about it, there's some books that like you read and then you just want to talk about them. And I think that the Remarkably Bright Creatures was one of those. Next up, and these are actually kind of out of order, but anyway, doesn't really matter. Next up, The Lighthouse at World's End by Amy Sparks. So this is actually the 4th book in a middle grade fantasy series. It starts with The House at the Edge of Magic. Then I forget what the second one is, or The Tower at the End of Time, and then The Bookstore at the Back of Beyond, and then The Lighthouse at World's End. So I actually did a video on the first 3 in the series, and I love those. They were so well written and funny and interesting, and I just gobbled them up. This one was good, but I give it 4 stars. There was something a little bit missing about it. It was really just more drama and less character development than I guess I wanted. But it's still really good, and I recommend all of them, and you can watch the video if you want to learn more about that. But that was just the 4th in the series. Next up, we have Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands. Now, I talked previously about Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, and this is the 2nd book that just came out not too long ago. Both of these books are just cozy fairy fantasy. They're not very smut, but they're sweet but also adventurous. But they never feel like anyone's gonna die. So they're just a really nice, relaxing, fun read. There's lots of fairy lore in them. And I don't know if Heather Fawcett, the author, actually did all the research on fairy lore and then put it in to the book, or she just made up all of this stuff, because Emily Wilde is supposed to be a scholar, and so she makes reference notes. Like, this is supposed to be her journal, and she makes reference notes in there. It's like, oh, this in 1865, this guy said this, blah, blah, blah. So it feels very authentic, which is really fun. And this is another good one. Just a nice, cozy read, something to read to relax. Then I have 2 books that I haven't finished yet. Well, one is called 4 Eads and a Funeral. That was an advanced reader's copy that I got when I was in London. And I thought, okay, well, I'll give this a try. I have not read anything like this before. And I DNF'd it, not because it was bad, but because I just didn't connect with it. So it's a teenage, it's a YA romance, and the miscommunication trope. And I just wasn't feeling it, because I'm like, I'm too old for this. But if you are into YA romance, and I think it's a pretty clean romance, I didn't get the feeling that this was going to go anywhere too personal. that might be of interest to you. Culturally, it's talking about Eid and the Muslim culture, and it's a Muslim community center is burnt down, and they're trying to rebuild it and get funds to rebuild it. And so these two characters that used to be friends, and they had like a falling out, and it's like how they get back to being friends, and then I guess boyfriend and girlfriend. It just wasn't for me. But anyway, next up is, and I haven't finished this one yet. I do plan to eventually, but it's a bit of a tough read. This is called Homegoing by Gyasi. So basically this book, it starts off with two sisters, although they don't actually know that they're sisters. Two sisters in Africa. I want to say the 1700s. It doesn't give us actual dates. It's a little vague, but it follows these sisters. One sister and her family stay in Africa, and the other sister and her, the generations after her, end up as slaves in America. And it follows them. And so it pretty much, like, each chapter just flips back and forth. And so you get a little bit about these sisters, but then you get more information. Then you get like a chapter about the son, and then the other sister's daughter, and back and forth and back and forth. And so it's kind of like little snippets of each person's life, like an important moment in their life through time. And but of course it's harsh. It's hard to read because it is all about slavery. It starts on the Ivory Coast, I believe, or the Gold Coast of Africa. And yeah, I mean, slavery is not really a super fun thing to read about, but it's really well written and a really interesting book. And I picked it up because I was going to read it with my book club, and then I couldn't make it to that meeting. And so then I have less impetus to finish it, because to me, it feels like a book that like you need to read and then you need to talk to someone about it, almost like a little bit of therapy, because there's so much going on, and it's so heavy that if you just kind of read it to yourself and then just sit there with it, it's a lot. But if you can read it and then talk to someone about it, I think that would be a much more beneficial reading experience. So that's my recommendation, is if you read it, then read it with someone and talk about it, because there's a lot to unpack in that book. Okay, so those are all the books that I read in March and April. And hopefully I will get to read a few more books in May, but maybe not, because I will be very, very busy. And hopefully I'll get to tell you about that soon. But let me know any of these books that you really liked, and leave comments about books that you think that I might also enjoy reading. And thanks for joining. Like and subscribe if you like this bookish content.